Ben Miller is Director, Threat Operations Center at Dragos, where he leads a team of analysts in performing active defense inside of ICS SCADA networks. Steve Miller is an incident response professional and principal researcher for FireEye. Please welcome Ben, Steve, and Dale to the S4 main stage.
Let's start the clock if we can.
All right, let's do it. So once again, Steve Miller. I don't really think you do need specialized OT tools or talent to detect attacks on ICS. Of course, this depends on how you define need, how you define ICS, how you define talent and tools, and so forth. But for the most part, I don't believe in ICS attacks. I believe in enterprise IT attacks that sometimes get deep enough to affect OT things. And if it doesn't start with a trusted partner or a VPN connection, typically starts with a spearfish, a weaponized document, maybe a Trojanized piece of software, or maybe it's a strategic web compromise. And simply by visiting the watering hole, your computer is infected. Then there's an initial backdoor. Then there's a secondary backdoor. Then the attacker has full access to just one single computer. The attacker lives off the land, though. Maybe starts using built-in utilities, native Windows things to poke around the computer, escalate privileges, download some additional stuff, and then maybe after that, lateral movement, internal network reconnaissance, and maybe some lightweight data theft that helps the attacker gain insights on how to deepen the intrusion later. And whether this is in mining, whether this is in high-tech software, casinos, retail, irrespective of industry vertical, almost all the big breaches start this way. And ICS is really no different. My role as a researcher at FireEye, I have the enormous privilege to work with many incident response teams globally. My job's awesome because I get to look at all the juicy data from all the intrusions we see around the world. And that's important because you get to see my worldview, my frame of reference, and maybe my bias is that I'm exclusively threat-centric, and I try to see everything through the eyes of an attacker. And last year, I started to learn a little bit about ICS intrusions. I read the blogs, written by some of the people in this room. I studied all the malware, but I came away thinking that they were really no different at all. They share all the same characteristics of intrusions I've seen across a dozen other industries. A lot of the same attacker tools, a lot of the same TTPs. The adversary methodology is almost identical every step of the way of the intrusion. So I don't think you need OT tools or talent to detect attacks on ICS, and I think this for two-ish reasons. At the macro level, we talked about this yesterday. Yes, the IT-OT convergence. It's real, it's happening, it's been like 20 years, but the homogenization of networks and the technology itself has become so similar that attacks in any enterprise work on ICS and OT environments. They do. And this manifests in a bunch of different ways. It has a lot of different effects on broader industry. But nowhere is this more interesting to me than PLCs. Yes, there are PLCs on the internet. They have IP addresses. They speak internet protocols. There are PLCs with built-in web servers. Instead of custom operating systems, there are PLCs running Linux and Windows 10. There are PLC HMI all-in-one monstrosities that have built-in VNC apps so you can connect from your phone. And this, to me, is an indication that the attack surface has been dramatically simplified, but that also means the defense surface is simplified. And if a PLC is a computer, I can defend it like a computer with no OT tools or talent required. So that's kind of the macro perspective. At the micro perspective, my opinion is all based on the intrusion evidence. I look at intrusion data nonstop, forensic data that allows me to study the adversary methods. And when I look at intrusions, there's really no better one, and no one I'm more qualified to talk about than Triton, because I've seen every little bit of forensic data from that incident response investigation. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. The Triton incident was discovered because of an interruption to an industrial process. And it's not quite the worst case scenario, but that is a pretty bad scenario. There were a couple of things about the Triton intrusion that were interesting to me, from the enterprise IT environment to the DMZ, down to the DCS, and down to the engineering workstations. Almost every facet of this intrusion used conventional attack tools, malware, utilities, and conventional attack methodologies. And we talked about Triton. Oh, it's so interesting, it's so novel, it's unprecedented, it's so unique. And we were saying that because that was the only piece of malware from the investigation that got leaked to the internet. Nobody talked about all the things that were the same along every step of the attacker lifecycle to get up to that point. We weren't the ones that leaked it to the internet, for what it's worth. When we did the incident response, guess what? We went in and we found a whole lot of evil. Malware, attacker footprints. We talked about a couple of the TTPs yesterday in that really insightful discussion about the lessons learned. But here are another couple ones that maybe you haven't heard. Mimikatz was launched not only from an EXE, but also by PowerShell. The attackers were living off the land. The attackers used web shells. The attackers compromised the VPN because they were using one-time passwords with cell phone numbers. Attackers used CryptCat backdoors, and RDP sessions tunneled through PuTTY-Link or P-Link. SSH tunnels with hard-coded key pairs. They use scheduled tasks for backdoor persistence. PSExec, Active Directory Explorer, other sysinternals utilities. Nmap, anybody ever heard of that one? I don't know, Meterpreter? Have you heard of that one? They use that one too. And my point of illustrating all of these is that these are amongst the most prevalent TTPs and attacker utilities and malware characteristics across all intrusions, across all industry verticals in the last 5 years. They are extremely conventional. So you have to ask yourself, in all of that threat activity, what OT tools and talent did the attacker need? And from the start all the way to that last little bit, the end, where they started really using Triton, the answer is none. They didn't need any skill, any OT skill, any OT talent, any OT tools to get up to that point. And so that brings me to what I call the rule of 99. I think this will hold up in real life. For any so-called ICS intrusion, 99% of the compromised systems will be Windows systems or conventional computers. In the Triton case, yeah, it was 100 systems, and 99 of them were Windows servers and workstations. And only one, just that one asset, the safety controller, required any special stuff to attack. So the rule of 99 means that the attacker footprint is 99% conventional attack characteristics, regular tools, regular utilities that are used anywhere else. And that also means that 99% of the detection opportunities are conventional detection opportunities. No special protocols, no special utilities. Really what we're talking about are basic computer intrusion techniques. So my emphasis here, as I want to say something poignant, is that focusing on the adversary life cycle is what allows you to detect an intrusion left of boom. Boom is that bad thing that you don't want to happen, the interruption of your industrial process, the loss of life, a plant explosion, and you want to detect as far away from boom as possible. And I believe you can do that by emphasizing your detection on attacker movements through the environment. I don't think you need special OT tools or talent to do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we got the clock set back to 10 minutes, so go ahead and start the clock, and Ben, you're up.
All right. Hey, everyone. How was Beer ISAC last night? See a lot of friends? It's fun coming to S4 and the community that's developed over the years and catching up with old friends, as well as other things at S4. So S4 is obviously a ICS-focused conference, one of many, but one of the best ones out there. It's full of community members. Later today, there will be a Cabana session full of ICS vendors as well as IT vendors that are focused on threat detection and response. There are tools out there that enable that. Dragos is a bit biased because we have one of those. Part of my argument is reality. Like, we're here, we're not at DEF CON, we're not going to other IT security-focused conferences. We are focused on understanding the problem and the challenges that our environments face. I think one of the areas from so I break my argument up into between tools as well as the talent. So two different arguments there, I think. The first one on tools, I think there's two arguments there. So one, you have IT-based tools that we can and should use in industrial environments. Like my position is not that we should avoid using tools at work. My argument is that instead you should not use tools that don't work, that aren't applicable to our environment. So a great tool, Network Miner, a new version was released last week, does a lot of identification and profiling of PLCs and other controllers in a passive fashion. Great tool. If you need that functionality, you can leverage that from an analysis perspective. As opposed to tools that don't work in OT environments, like default vulnerability scanning, for instance. Not a detection tool, but a tool that has been talked about at length on how do you safely use vulnerability scanning actively in an OT environment. I feel that shouldn't happen. I feel that the level of effort that you have to put into that tool in order to be able to safely use that is not worth it. Why don't we have our own tools that can be tailored to the OT environment and be effective and actually enable the teams that are working there rather than the teams being confined by the tools? Secondly, the OT-focused tools are enabling new features, new use cases that don't exist inside of IT environments. There's a range of tools out there that does visualization of the environment, which for both asset discovery as well as detection. That use case doesn't really exist inside of an enterprise network because of just the scale of the number of assets. It becomes really challenging to look at a blob of dots when there's 100,000 dots in your enterprise. But on the flip side, on the OT side, it becomes very helpful from not only understanding what's in the environment, but the trust relationships that are occurring in that environment and the outliers and zone-to-zone analysis of that data. IT tools have certain assumptions about them, that they're assuming that you talk to the internet all the time. So that's fine. You can deploy those tools, and then you can spend the time tuning out what you need in order to be effective. Or you can have tools that are based on the assumption that, no, you shouldn't talk to the internet. You should have multiple network segments based on your processes and whatnot, where you want to understand the relationship between the hosts as they're crossing zones. And you want that natively so that you can quickly ID traffic that shouldn't exist, such as Mimikatz moving across a zone, for instance. Yesterday, Dale talked about AV being a challenge when he was interviewing Rob. AV is like the quintessential IT tool that almost doesn't really apply. It applies, it's really hard to be effective there. As far as many directories are whitelisted, and it's impairing the capability of antivirus. It's hard to get updates to the devices. And all of these are challenges. These are the constraints that the IT tool is putting into the OT environment. So now, instead of being effective in mining for detections, you're administrating the tools that you're trying to actually use to secure your environment. Finally, talent. I had a discussion on my way out here on, well, are you saying you can't have a IT person trained into OT from a response or detection capability? Absolutely. You have to have an appreciation of the environment and the implications of that. The environment has real life consequences. There's physics involved with things that happen there. The best example, going back to Trisis, it is when we were reversing Trisis, we had two analysts that were doing that. Jimmy, a great reverse engineer, he joined that week at Dragos. And then Reed Whiteman as well was part of that and has been part of the community now for years. And so they made an excellent team. Jimmy got to polish off his PowerPC reversing and assembly code, and he did great effect to reversing that. And he's like, I understand what this function is doing. I don't know what it means. And that's where Reed was invaluable, working alongside Jimmy to explain the implications of what that does on the controller and what that means for the overall facility. So Steve had mentioned 99% of the attack is IT. The 1% is what matters. That's where we need OT capabilities so that it doesn't even get to the 1%, and so that you actually identify the focus of the attack rather than, oh, it was just an enterprise attack. You need to be able to connect all those dots together. Finally, the on-ramp was this week as well, working on training more in the workforce, enabling that. I think that's another case in recognition that we need ICS talent. One of the biggest challenges in the community is the challenge of finding people that have the background and skills inside this environment. And that's not just doing assessments or architecture, that's doing detection, response, and really a recognition that these attacks do happen, and you can't architect your way out of it. You have to monitor the devices. You have to understand that there is potential for attack no matter how well you construct your network. Attacks will happen, and you need to be ready for it, and you need to be looking for it. And then finally, from a talent growth perspective, so I'm fortunate to have a great team that has a very diverse background. So we have 18 people on my team that are out there doing incident response, doing assessments. I have chemical engineers. I have PEs. I have digital forensics experts. I have folks that have been pen testing all across the world for years now. There's not some universities are starting to offer concentrations inside of for industrial control systems and OT environments. But largely, this is a new field. This really, I would say, didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, and we're catching up to the fact of that we need specialization. Dan Gear, who was here last year at S4, he had a quote that he quoted in a paper from 2013 on trends in cybersecurity. Generalists are becoming rare, and they are being replaced with specialists. What we do, us as a community, we are a group of specialists. We're hyper-focused on where we're going and the challenges that exist.
Thank you. I've been waiting for someone to get cut off. Okay, so that's good.
You're welcome.
Thank you for doing that. So that's the first round. Now we get to rebuttal. So now you'll each get 5 minutes. So we have 5 minutes on the clock. And Steve, go ahead.
Whoa. Okay. All right. I think there are some other arguments to be made. Clearly, this is an academic debate. It's intentionally polarized. It ignores a lot of the nuances of managing a broad spectrum of risk across an even broader spectrum of technology. But it can be useful to think about, because what we're talking about in the models and the architecture, which don't necessarily keep you safe, is we are always thinking about where we want to detect an attack. And we go back to that Purdue model. You know, it's up here, it's here, it's here, it's here, it's here. And the closer we get to the bottom, the closer we get to, you know, the physical world or real time or what have you. There's an argument to be made that the concept of ICS is a defender construct, right? Attackers don't think like that. They don't differentiate between IT and OT. Attackers see computers and they see not computers. They see computer networks and they see not computer networks. If computers are present in that entire chain, then to an attacker, the Purdue model isn't dead, it just never existed. And in that entire chain, you have decisions to make about where you want to detect things. And I don't disagree that you probably need special OT tools to monitor. You need special OT talent to deploy and integrate these things into your environments. But when it comes to the features of the attack, the adversary methods, the actual TTPs and malware, those things can be present anywhere in that entire spectrum. And the logic, the analytics of detecting those things don't necessarily require OT tools or talent. And it's not that OT tools and talent can't detect these things. It's that they're really just not required. And if you require those things, that means you're missing a whole lot of stuff throughout the duration of that intrusion. The Triton attack took, 3 years. There's evidence to say that it began sometime in 2014. So maybe instead of thinking about where you want to detect it, why don't you think about when? Do you want to detect it in year 1, year 2, or do you want to detect it in year 3 when your plant operations are interrupted? And you, as the asset owner, as protecting that industrial process or stopping boom, however you define it, you have the choice of investing in different places along the way. And there's no world in which you don't have OT tools and talent, right? Like, that's an impractical world. Instead of building walls at one place or the other, you have to build traps along the way. You have to target the adversary's process of advancing down through that defender construct, which they don't care about. And then you also have to think about the intrusion life cycle and stopping it along the way before it really puts your industrial process at risk. That is my thinking. In terms of talent, I think talent can actually, go either way. It can be grown. How do you define OT talent? I reverse engineered the tri-station protocol, and if you count yesterday, I have exactly 1 day of ICS training an experience. So my point is that defining OT stuff, that's going to change how you invest in detection along the way. And again, think about computers and not computers. Think about the adversary life cycle and detecting TTPs, because you get the choice of being the organization that detects the attacker at the safety system, or literally any time before that, which is probably better. But I'm a defender, right? And I want to stop the bad guys no matter what the cost. So that's my take on it, and I think you should stop them way before you put your industrial process at risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's start the clock.
So many thoughts and everything's washing in my head. This is hard. So let's see. The assumption is that the attack's going to happen through the corporate network. The attacks also happen through other methods. You can receive a piece of equipment that's already compromised. You have vendor network, support networks that are connected to you. You have technicians that are not yours that are roaming your facilities, interacting with this equipment. You also have enterprise networks that are largely unsuccessful at detecting and mitigating. The dwell time in enterprise network is still measured in hundreds of days oftentimes. And so saying that, I got this, IT will solve your problems before it gets to you, isn't necessarily a very reassuring thing that we're doing the right thing from a discovery or incident response process. You had mentioned TRICE, or the TCM protocol, which was in Python, so you could read. You could read the Python code and go, oh, okay, it's sending these packets, these function codes. You're still not going to understand what the controller is doing with those function codes. So you understand the network communications that are happening. The focus of OT, or like network security monitoring, it's not about the coverage of the protocols that you have to worry about. Does it support my protocols? Yes, I mean, you need some base level assurance there. But the challenge is understanding what the protocols do, how they interact with the devices, and what the response on the controllers themselves are. Let's see. In addition to that, I had like 10 points in my head. In addition to that, I yield my time.
Okay. Okay, that's good. So now you have a chance to ask each other a question. Do you have a question?
I do now.
We'll let you go first, so you can
Now
ask.
Now I collect my thoughts. I'm
okay,
ready. Yeah.
you can ask a question of Steve.
All right. So you use the example of the Triton Trisis breach. On how, if you're having an impact in a facility, how are you going to match that to an enterprise attack that happened 2 months ago? There's that connecting of the dots of understanding that some phishing attack led to something so sophisticated that has been on the network dwell time without OT tools. You don't have any OT tools. You don't have any detective capabilities in that environment. We're focused on it came in from the corporate environment. How would you be able to connect those dots?
Challenging question, primarily because it takes a lot of time. An incident response for something like Triton takes months. And obviously, you want to operate throughout the duration of that intrusion rather than just having to shut your plant down because of an intrusion. So it's certainly a challenge, but when all we're talking about is computers, so NTFS Windows forensics, for the most part, doesn't require me to know anything special about the environment And when I map out what the attacker artifacts are, I see where they came from and where they want to. And over time, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, as you collect information from these systems, you're able to connect the dots together. Not just going back 100 days of dwell time, but going back 1,000 days of dwell time. That presents a challenge to anyone who is intruded, obviously, because, again, you want to operate throughout the breach, not just shut everything down. So the answer is I don't know.
Okay. So now you have a chance to ask Ben a question if you like.
My question, Mr. Miller, is, we talked about an intrusion, from a bona fide intrusion, from an interactive intrusion, from a remote human attacker. That's absolutely not the only thing that we worry about. One of the other things that has been so consequential to ICS environments are things that we didn't expect, such as crypto miners and ransomware. So my question to you, Mr. Miller, is what aspects of WannaCry, say, require special OT tools and talent to detect?
To detect. From a detection standpoint, I agree you're probably going to leverage the perimeter and the detections that may be on the host. So if you do have endpoint protection such as antivirus, or you just more likely than not, your detection is when your screen changes and you have a ransom note on your screen. That's more likely the case from that aspect. If it doesn't get enabled because it can't get out, if it's the kill switch version, then you're going to get network traffic to ID on that. The advantage of using OT tools is irrespective of how you're IDing the traffic, it becomes very obvious that any traffic that is trying to reach the internet is an outlier, unusual, it should be responded to, let alone the very long string of characters that it calls out to. Like you don't need an ID on that as an indicator. You could just ID on that as a fact that it is something that should not happen in that environment from an OT perspective.
Okay. Well, we have just a little bit of time, which is good because I had one question for each of you. Ben, I'll start with you.
Okay.
So I heard a lot of what you were saying, especially in the first 10 minutes. And I was thinking, that's response. That's response. The crisis analysis that you're talking about that these, smart people did, that was after it had been detected. Mm-hmm. Can you, and the question, Steve came up with the question, so maybe he biased the question a little bit, but from a pure detection standpoint, can you think of a public incident, something that's out there now that has affected ICS, that would have required specialized OT tools and talent to detect?
To detect. Let's see. I want to say it comes down to how do you define the tools and technology. So I feel that you would need to have the talent in order to understand. So it's one thing to detect a lateral movement to a Windows XP box. It's another thing to understand that, with that detection, the implication of that. It's not a Windows XP box. It's an engineering workstation, and it also programmed a controller at the moments later. That context, that understanding is inherently OT focused, and you can say, well, a lateral movement to XP box is just a valid detection. But it's now putting all the legwork on the individual. Remember, we have a workforce problem. It's really hard to find good people. Everyone's understaffed. You need that capability to give you context so that you understand the attack itself and can be able to map out all the relationships between that engineering workstation and the other devices.
Okay. Let me switch to your side now. So, Steve, you talked about these attacks coming from the enterprise network and coming in through this thing where your, let's say, traditional detection capability would be sufficient. But what about the case that we're beginning to see where someone outside your scope of control, a vendor, let's say outside, has access into your ICS, and they are directly using OT technologies? They're coming through an approved pipe, so they don't have to hop to get there all the places you detect, but they're actually going right into your OT network using OT specialized protocols. Wouldn't you require OT tools and talent to detect those kinds of attacks that are coming in, potentially coming in the future?
Let's go back to Triton, and I think yes, in an extremely rare scenario. So say the attacker has VPN credentials from somebody's enterprise IT environment and comes into your environment, and instead of hopping through places, somehow gets directly to the engineering workstation. And that type of one-to-one attacker connection is going to be extremely challenging to detect for anybody. Doesn't matter whether you have IT or OT knowledge or detections there. And I think this is actually the best case for OT detection, because say the attacker from that engineering workstation now it's like doing stuff with the controller. One of the things we saw the Triton attacker do was send a lot of tri-station pings to the controller. And if you've ever listened to a tri-station network, pings are actually fairly rare. They shouldn't be sending hundreds of them. And so that's something that you probably do require OT tools and knowledge to detect and to interpret correctly. So that, I know that's a point against me, but I think that's a really good point to illustrate.
Okay, well, let's give a round of applause to our debaters.
Yep.
So